I imagine that they expect the workplace to be a kind of inexhaustible breast. They expect the company to be just providing, and they shirk at resistance or refusal or boundaries or even just consequences for unprofessional and poor behavior. And like I said, and then you start see the nasty coming out. Yeah.
Welcome to This Isn't Working, the podcast for employers and employees who think it's time to talk about the failings of workplace culture and how we can do better. I'm your host, Tanya de Grunwald, an HR commentator who's watching, listening, and hopefully asking the right questions. Okay, let's get this working. Hi, everybody. So today we're looking at the question of how employers should handle their activist staff. And to help us explore this, I'm joined by Jaco van Zyl, who's a clinical psychologist. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, you and I have been having sort of late night phone calls. This is going to sound a bit weird, since we met at a conference about 18 months ago. Because we discovered that we have rather a weird and unexpected sort of crossover within our work, and you might not necessarily put us as having anything in common professionally, but we do. How would you kind of describe the shared strands that we have to this audience, just in like one sentence or two?
Well, I think between you and I think we recognize BS when we see it. And I think we have a proclivity of getting into trouble for maybe speaking out where, while everybody else might be too reluctant to be doing that. So I think there's something of that sort going on. And maybe we're a bit transgressive in terms of what the current mores are. And we're like, no, this is nonsense. This isn't, well, no pun intended, this isn't working, and this is why.
Do you think there's also a tendency that we both see some of the dark stuff that's going on? And I sometimes see it when I'm sort of doom scrolling late at night, and I sometimes text you and go, oh my God, I've just seen this weird thing.
Yeah,
and you're quite often thinking similar things to me. And we're looking at it, you're looking at it from a psychological perspective, and I'm looking at it from an HR perspective. Yeah. But there's a strange amount of overlap that we've found, wouldn't you say?
Well, you've got to find ways of coping with the darkness and the craziness and the elements of deterioration that we see around ourselves. So, I think to satirize, to humorize what is going on around us is a good way of coping with the current chaos. And it's artificially induced, by the way. This current chaos is most certainly artificially induced, and it caught well because of the kind of culture that the West developed into.
I think I didn't quite expect to see quite so much sort of darkness and personal stuff when I started doing an HR workplace podcast. But you get what you don't always get what you signed up for. But anyway, so I think I think with regards to the topic that I've chosen about activist employees, I think a growing number of employers are reporting problems in this sort of area now. And I think it's as they try to depoliticize and rebalance the workplace after a few years when things went pretty crazy in some cases, they're now experiencing pushback from usually quite a small number of very vocal staff members who seem to have become quite accustomed to having an outsized role in shaping the culture and policies of their organization, frankly, in line with what appear to be just their own political views. So I would say, one flashpoint is in reassessing resource allocation around DEI, which might be things like removing budget from internal staff groups and asking people to do that sort of work in their own time or off-site, or making decisions about redundancies, cutting the size of DEI teams or particular roles. Another flashpoint, I would say, is staff starting to make demands around kind of in response to geopolitical events. So wanting their employer to make statements about Israel and Gaza or about Reform UK or flags or Farage or any of that kind of stuff, making decisions about whether the organization should quit X, on account of some sort of perceived, feelings about Elon Musk. And then we've also got Pride is now looming large. It's in June in the UK. So requests are coming through to sort of show solidarity with what these activists would call the trans community. We've still got, in the UK, we're still having problems with making sure that employers really understand the Supreme Court ruling and what that means. It's been very unhelpful that the employers haven't had the guidance published yet. The law is clear, but I think that guidance would indeed be helpful. And I think in the meantime, lots of activists have taken that opportunity to kind of create confusion and chaos around that particular issue. So I think that's probably another example, again, of one of the issues where I think employers are having to face this. So I think lots of HR departments are finding that they're getting those sorts of vibes from their staff. I think there's particularly a problem that we're hearing about in the arts. I know the group Freedom in the Arts is working on a new report, which will include analysis about the power of kind of boycotts, both from the public but also from staff. So things like staff at their venues, at sort of theatres and concert halls and that kind of stuff, refusing to work on certain shows and things like that. So we'll probably do another episode on the sort of strategy and legal issues for employers around these sorts of topics. But my sense is that I think we first need to understand what we're looking at here, what we're dealing with on a psychological level, because I think there's some actually quite dark stuff going on here, which I'm not sure employers understand or are prepared for. I mean, I say that, but now that I say that, I actually think they might have had an inkling that there's something a bit weird going on here. What I mean is I think they've always sort of known that there's something a bit menacing and unpredictable here. I think they've would have caught glimpses of it over the last, this is not new, this stuff. So over the last 5 years or so, they will have caught glimpses or maybe flashes of it when they've tried to push back or ask questions. And I think they've ended up indulging it just to sort of keep the peace. And I think then that plan is now not working anymore. It's not a sustainable plan. It might have been the right short-term plan, but it is not a long-term plan. And I think they always knew that things were going to kick off when they pushed back, which is why they didn't do it sooner. So let's first look at what's going on. What are we actually looking at here? So when I started looking into this and finding critics of DEI, when I was starting to think, I'm not sure about some of this stuff, it struck me very early on that the political commentators talking about DEI are not quite right, I think, to categorize DEI as a purely political movement. I could see straight away that DEI is powered, or the sort of foot soldiers of it, really, I'm talking about. We'll probably talk about those most on this call. It's sort of powered by something that's deeply, deeply personal. Would you agree with that assessment, that it's often characterized as more political than perhaps it should be, or that the personal bit is undervalued?
Exactly. It is most certainly political. That's without dispute. But I mean, for something like this to have caught hold on people's minds so systemically, so globally in the West, tells us something about not only the politics, but also the culture of the West. And culture is downstream of psychology, or there's an intricate interaction between culture and psychology. If people in a certain culture isn't psychologically predisposed to certain ideas, it won't get a foothold in that culture. So it's most certainly cultural, so it's socio-political, cultural, but most certainly also psychological. I'm a clinical psychologist, and in clinical psychology, we're concerned not just with the individual in front of us, we're also concerned with groups. We have with group therapy, and historically, especially in psychoanalysis and in social psychology, there has been this acute interest in the psychology of groups, especially large groups. And there's been a lot written about how the hive mind or the group mind functions and what it reveals about the people's underlying instincts, what their grievances are, etc. So in my work as a clinical psychologist, look, to be honest, as a clinical psychologist, when I'm working with patients with severe disorders and challenges and severe suffering, obviously I'm taking on a different position towards that person. But when I think in terms of groups, and when I engage and I put on my hat as a culture critic, obviously I harness my knowledge of psychology to assess what is going on and what these trends and developments are around us, and what our insight in psychology reveals as to what is actually happening around us, psychologically, collectively. So I'm not only a clinical psychologist, I'm also co-director of an organization called Critical Therapy Antidote. And we're concerned with the politicization, the political capture of the therapy profession. And because of this political capture, or the radical ideological capture of the therapy profession, we see that the profession is being hollowed out and that it has lost its therapeutic, its healing ethos, and is being turned into a profession of activism, fostering disease, harnessing disease for the purpose of revolution, radical change people want to bring about in our society. So I'm very much familiar not only with the political background, the new Marxian reformulations around identity that has given rise to DEI initiatives, or that has been operationalized in DEI initiatives. I'm also very familiar with the underlying psychology that facilitates such instinctual movements.
Mm. What I've noticed because I've sat in an awful lot of sort of online webinars, but also in-person kind of groups of these sort of DEI workshops and things like that. And I've noticed a few different characters in these groups. And I think different people are drawn to sort of what we might call woke workplace activism and DEI, talking about really the kind of foot soldiers of this sort of movement, this sort of work. I think people are drawn to it for different reasons. And when I'm in these groups or on these calls, I notice some people are noisier than others. Some people are very quiet. Some people just nod along. It's quite difficult to read why everybody's there, but some people are very vocal. Could you just run us through who's there and why?
Yeah, and this is actually an idea that I heard. I think it was, I can't remember who actually said it. I think I was listening to James Lindsay, and one of the things that he said, and he has quite a lot of material that he puts out, and there are 5 levels in which we could formulate what is going on around us culturally. There are the ringleaders, those who know exactly what they're doing. They study early theorists, political theorists, radical, subversive writers of the past. They study psychoanalysis. In other words, they understand how the mind works. And these are the people who also make use of certain sentiments that are already present in culture and language, and they harness those in order to bring about these cultural and civilizational changes they want to see happen. So we have the ringleaders, and then we have the strivers. The strivers don't quite know what the theoretical bases are of these political movements, but they've noticed that culture has changed to such an extent. We're in a victimhood culture that if you're a victim, or if you're seen as a hero of the victims, there are some social credits up for grabs. So these are usually rather vocal, rather zealous strivers towards the excellence in promoting these DEI initiatives. And these can be both. These can be either the grievance people, those with the special identities or identity markers, who are automatically just immunized from all responsibility or accountability, and who are so idealized they don't even consider themselves as potentially super destructive. And even if they did, they couldn't really care less, because all that matters in their own minds is themselves. So you have these victim groups, but then you also have these strivers who may belong to the so-called oppressor groups, but they want to be allies. They want to be advocates, see? And they can be just as vocal and dangerous in certain organizations. So you have the ringleaders, the strivers, and then you have the normies. And that is possibly the largest group. And the normies are people who just want to go to work, who really just want to do a good day's work, have their family, have their kids, have their sport activities and their friends. And they might notice some of these trends, but they're not really bought into the politics of the season, of the day. So those are the normies. And then you have the doubters, those who've noticed, but hang on, there's a major cultural shift that has taken place. Our workplace has changed. This is toxic. I'm not too sure that what is going on is really achieving what the wrapper says it's meant to achieve. And then the final level are the people like you and me, those who say stupid things and sometimes get into trouble, or who just outright challenge the nonsense, the psychopathy that we see around us.
So one thing I've noticed is that in the first chunk of the hour-long session that will quite often be given to these sorts of topics, different kinds of workplace issues or groups, about the first third of the hour is spent with everybody telling everybody about their own story. And quite often there are real themes that come up, their own personal stories. And quite often it's to do with, I was bullied at school, or I was adopted. Lots of people who say they were bullied at school. Actually, that comes up a lot. Lots of people who have got some kind of outsider status, and lots of people who will share an awful lot of quite personal stuff, like really personal. Some of it's really quite dark. People will share stuff about abuse, all sorts of stuff that they've been through. And I'm sort of thinking, like, I'm going to sound horrible, but I'm sorry to hear that. But this is like 10:30 on a Tuesday morning at a webinar with 100 people on it, which is being hosted by some insurance company. Like, what are we doing on this online call, hearing this person's stuff? It seems to me completely inappropriate. It's appropriate in a therapy session, but it feels like the whole thing feels like group therapy. But there's no therapist, and we don't even know who the group is. And that's the bit when I started questioning it, going, what on earth is going on here?
Yeah.
But within the group dynamic, that's kind of that's normalized, isn't it?
Yeah. So, okay, you're touching on quite a few things there. So, by all means, many of us have had experiences of being bullied, have gone through terrible trauma, being adopted, have attachment issues, maybe have a formal diagnosis, maybe a neurodevelopmental disorder or diagnosis too. That may be true. And that does reflect a time or an experience when we were, or when they were, victims. But we also know that victims, or their victimhood or hurt or trauma, when not appropriately dealt with, can become rather dysfunctional, even destructive. So back in South Africa, I used to work at the prison there. And all those violent criminals who have done heinous things, from doing traumatic things to children, to murder, to doing traumatic things to the elderly, farm murders, things like those, all of them somewhere have trauma in their past. But see, if our filter only privileges one theme, namely victimhood, we will see the trauma bearer only as a victim. Whereas in reality, a trauma bearer can be both victim and villain, can be both victim and, or can be both traumatized and destructive. And that is that aspect of human nature that often gets lost, especially in this current discourse of grievance, of dissatisfaction, of almost a morality where compassion and empathy, the way they understand or define empathy, reigns supreme. Then that person can only be seen as a victim and not as someone who's also devastating and destructive. So just on that note. The other thing that you mentioned there is that it turns the workplace into like a quasi-therapy space. And I agree with you. The workplace is not supposed to be a therapy space because we're not doing therapy there. The discourse of a workspace would be things like, we have certain needs, we have certain things to achieve. We better work hard towards achieving those things. Another aspect, another discourse of the workplace is, there are certain things you need to learn. You may be under the impression that this is reality. Hang on. Education time, training time, this is reality. So these are two different discourses. When when we turn workplaces into almost extended daycare centers, especially with the new generation coming in, we change it to what we call a hysterical discourse, where the workplace is used to voice dissatisfactions, existential dissatisfactions, personal dissatisfactions. And because these dissatisfactions are connected to identity, for as long as that person is there with that identity, those dissatisfactions will loom large, and that muddies the space of work.
Mm. So do you think in that respect, I guess we're talking about most people in most workplaces are not spending a huge amount of their time talking about this stuff. I guess why I want to talk about these groups is that these are the people that are for whom their role is a large percentage of it is this, or a large part of their workplace persona is this. So they are a big part of the staff networks, for example. And the staff network is probably the thing that they like most about their job, even if they don't work in the DEI team particularly. So I think it's worth everyone else in the organization understanding that this particular group is spending an awful lot of time in these sort of quasi-therapeutic spaces. And what I've started to look at is that, and I think you might have mentioned to me when we've spoken before, is that actually this sort of stuff is their dream this is their dream ideology. This is their dream scenario of bringing in all of this stuff into their workplace. I think there's a sense that they get some status from it as well. It's either from the trauma itself or from the role in the DEI, in the staff network, or whatever they're doing. Sometimes they're a leader of it. Sometimes they're just an ally. They're getting some kind of status from it. The employer is also quite often funding this group in some way, which I think also gives some kind of validation to the seriousness of it. They get a budget to bring some trainer in. I use the term trainer loosely. If it's Pride, they'll buy a whole load of stuff for the, T-shirts for the march and all this kind of stuff. It also gives them an instant line to sort of senior champions who might even be at board level. So instantly they all feel quite important. Does that strike you as something that they're getting something from it? I think it's sort of feeding them in a way. Is that right?
Right. So there are quite a few things that you mentioned there. So where it comes to certain identities, and as soon as we start talking about victimhood identities, we start seeing individuals no longer as potential adults who can be held accountable and responsible for what they're supposed to be doing, but we start relating towards them as infants. And they also adopt this almost quasi-infantile position because they belong to some so-called victim group. And because they are victims, and with it comes a sense of immunity against this responsibility, we see some self-idealization taking place. And with self-idealization comes certain entitlements. And this can create certain cultures where grievance can actually proliferate because they would have, like you said, special access to seniors that other people do not have special access to, or they get away with bad behavior where others would not get away with bad behavior. So psychologically, self-idealization, there is obviously a great measure of narcissism taking place. And as soon as you start opposing them, then you see sparks fly, and then they potentially resort to some forms of manipulation. It is problematic because, again, if we think about the workspace is actually supposed to be what we call a very paternal space. There are certain rules. It is not a personal space. It is a public space. So we prefer you keep personal things at home or things that might be too heavy to carry at work, to deal with those things at home. But because they turn their workspace into a personal space, the paternal gets changed into the maternal. And their entitlements are such that they're almost, again in psychology, their entitlements can sometimes be so unreasonable. I imagine that they expect the workplace to be a kind of inexhaustible breast. They expect the company to be just providing, and they shirk at resistance or refusal or boundaries or even just consequences for unprofessional and poor behavior. And like I said, and then you start see the nasty coming out. Yeah.
So there's something about the relationship with the employer as the sort of mum that rings a bell with me, because things like, these are people who like to report, you know, wrong speech to HR. That these are the people that report microaggressions, even if there was no ill intent to whatever somebody said. And there is a sort of, it's like, you know, I'm going to go and tell mum on you type thing. So there definitely is a sort of, and I guess it's that kind of coddling thing they're looking for from the employer as the mother. This is getting weird for an HR podcast, but I'm going to push on. So and then, do you know what it's making me think of? I think I sent you that video with the with what happened at Condé Nast. So I think it was either October or November, there was a sort of protest in the hallway. People watching this might have seen it. There were some people who got made redundant from Teen Vogue. Teen Vogue was, I think, sort of folded into Vogue.com or Vogue as a whole. And I think some of the roles that went were the writers who covered things like reproductive rights and LGBT and climate change. And so their friends who were still there, I think there were about 12 of them, ended up standing outside in the hallway of this very smart office in the middle of Manhattan, outside the office of the HR director of Condé Nast, who's a chap called Stan Duncan. And there's video footage of him, which then ended up online, him basically telling them to go back to their desks, that he's heard their objections to their friends being made redundant, but it's time to go back to their desks now. And then they're sort of following him down the hallway. They're kind of haranguing him. And I did some research about this guy, and I'm thinking, I mean, he has some quite substantial commercial experience, but I'm pretty sure he never will have encountered something like that before.
So everyone, we'd appreciate if you would go back to the workplace where you're...
Is there a place that you would be able to speak to us?
Not today. We have other things going on.
Do you think we're not worth speaking to, Stan?
Those are your words, not mine.
But they might be your beliefs.
They're not my beliefs.
Oh, okay. So you do think we're worth speaking to?
Everyone should go back to your workplace.
I work here.
You dismiss us instead of talk to us.
You told us that we had to come work in person here 4 days a week. This is our workplace.
Like our hot viper now, which is a problem.
Stan, are you running away from us?
No, I'm directing you back to your place of work.
Okay, where's my place of work?
If you could just go this way, you guys.
Will you come this way with us? No,
I'm in a meeting. I'm working.
Okay, well, we have some quick questions. If you answer them, we'd be happy to go back to our desks.
All right. Thank you.
For you?
Thank you.
You don't want to answer any questions?
I've directed you back to your workplace.
Is that a good answer, guys?
Absolutely not. Come on, Stan.
Not a really good answer, Stan.
We're concerned about our colleagues.
Yeah.
We're concerned
about our company.
You're disengaging with the employees who work here.
Did you let go of Teen Vogue for political reasons?
I think he was quite shocked by it. He was actually quite cool under pressure. And actually after that, he then got rid of 4 more of them as a result of that. And they are now saying that was an infringement on their right to protest. So they're bringing in the unions. What I saw on camera was the kind of end point to a group of people in the workplace who have got so detached from what is reasonable kind of workplace behavior that they think it's okay to go to the boss's office and start harassing him, filming it, put it online, and that you're going to get your way from doing that. Now, I'm thinking at that point, because he's been at Condé Nast since 2019, I looked it up, and I bet he's thinking I should have pushed back on these people much sooner. That's what I'd be thinking if I was him. But also, I think I think it's quite shocking to see. And then he pushes back on them, and then anyway, now they're claiming it's their right to protest. It is their right to protest outside the office, but not in the office. It's their right to protest, all sorts of things. Anyway, so they've made it into a political fight. But I think so at that point, I guess, Condé Nast is mummy, but he's behaving in a paternal role in that point. He's the dad. And
he's saying no.
Yeah. So he's putting down some boundaries. What did you see from that video? You saw something similar to me?
Absolutely. So did you see right in the beginning where that young fella, the instigator with a phone, wanted to discuss certain things, and the boss said, "Go back to your desks." And the little manipulative boy with the camera said, are you saying that our concerns aren't important to you? And then the boss said, those are your words. Oh, he says, are you thinking it so? Again, those are your words. So you can see how how manipulative they are, how they reel this person in. That person, the boss, didn't stand a chance, because these are all very rich, very affluent, probably very spoiled young people. And yet they could imagine that they were so oppressed that they could be entitled to specialized attention. This is also just maybe an extension of the kind of life they live outside the office. I'm sure at home, among their friends, they're as horrible, they're as intolerable, right? So if we formulate it now, they're so used to being coddled, they're so used to being idealized. There's no boundaries or no's outside the office, and now they bring those attitudes and those personalities into the office, and they expect the office to also treat them as these special little kids. And now, isn't it interesting, when the boss said, no, go back to your offices, they kept on pushing. But that boss stuck to his guns, and they were consequences. And great for him. Four more of them fired. I hope that little ringleader was fired too. Consequences, it's necessary. And to look in social psychology, this concept of modeling, social learning. So those others who may have gone along may have learned their lesson, because these are the kinds of consequences you can expect if you're a disruptive little anarchist trying to turn your workplace into your room in the basement. It's not the way it works. They need to grow up. And so what was also on display to me, and this is a clinical concept, it's a newly formed concept, is millennial narcissism. They have their ideas. They impose their ideas. It's called narcissistic extension of the self. In other words, their environment needs to echo their whims. It's a fusion type defense. And when they don't get what they demand their environment to provide, the echoing, the affirmations, that is what we see in clinical narcissism, they feel attacked and they start turning destructive. And that is what we see happening there. Only in group fashion. There were a few little tag-alongs, right, who maybe not have been as courageous as the major ringleaders, but they were equally resentful as the ringleaders were. And yeah, consequences. Good on them, on him, the boss.
Yeah, lots of HR directors are women. I think it's quite interesting, the dynamic that he's a man. Because if it had been a woman doing that, then I think she would have gone into the kind of mean mummy role. I don't know, maybe there's nothing in that.
Oh, I think you have a point there.
I've seen a mean mummy character, which is either J.K. Rowling or it's Margaret Thatcher. If it's older gay men particularly, they use the same tone for Margaret Thatcher and how some of her policies they perceive, led to them feeling less than when they were at school because of Section 28. And then J.K. Rowling is spoken about in exactly the same terms, in terms of how women's rights activism. She's like the mean woman. But the mean dad is Elon Musk, is Trump, is Nigel Farage. So that there are these sort of characters that spring up. And I think there's a dynamic within the group. There is this it's like the kids want to take over the kids want to run the school. And that's what I saw happening.
So if you read the original literature around DI, or the literature that inspired DI, it's very much applied postmodernism. It's all about power and privilege, power linked to identity, and identity as a knowledge holder. So in the discourse of many of these writings, you see that they resent power. Power is bad. Power corrupts. That is that is so devious. Because what we see, especially in that hallway, is an attack on power. But it's not just an attack on power. It is also a ramping up of their own. So it's not altogether true that they want to destroy power. They want to replace existing power with a different kind of power. And to resist that, you need someone who's firm enough to do that. But there's something you mentioned about the female role, and I think that is also significant. And you and I have also spoken about this. Helen, I always get her surname wrong, Helen Andrews, around the major feminization of society. Let's be honest now. On a normal distribution curve, most women will be very empathic. A normal distribution curve of men, the majority of men will not be empathic. So certain roles fit women better, and they gravitate towards those roles. And if you have an industry that is that's dominated by women, and they have a biological proclivity, and just imagine millions upon millions of interactions, communication interactions and iterations skewed towards empathy, you get this kind of tolerance for bad behavior. Whereas if greater paternity, greater masculinization of the workplace could take place, you would see a greater sense of boundaries, of rules, of logic, as opposed to this emotional manipulation that many of these activists resort to.
Yeah. I mean, you do see this stuff happening in some male-dominated industries as well. I'll come back to the gender thing for another episode. I think it's really interesting, but I'm not sure. I think it's probably an episode in itself. You've mentioned before about how this idea about that they become the kind of good ones, the moral ones. And I think we saw that in the hallway at Condé Nast as well. I think I've seen that in various groups and things I've been in. And the way that they talk about everybody outside of the group, particularly, guess what, white, straight men, but also, Republicans, reform voters, people with gender critical views, TERFs, they would say, there's a real othering. They say they're so anti-othering, but actually they are very happy to other all these other groups, some of which are quite large groups because they're the minority, the oppressed minority. And it sort of hypes up this fear of discrimination and violence sort of against them. And they have to be their little group has to be really cohesive. It strikes me that these staff networks have become the absolute perfect place I think the employers, what they've done accidentally is create the absolute perfect place for these people to get together right in the heart of the organization, on site usually, to talk to each other and to create this feeling that we are the good and the moral ones. I think also the fact that there are so many of these diversity kind of awards and galas, which are off-site, I think those again strengthen this whole feeling, having been at some of these things occasionally. There's this real feeling of we're the good ones. You're safe here. We are the nice ones. We are the moral ones. And outside is full of mean, horrible people. Does it strike you that they are kind of somehow creating a little club in some way to protect themselves from the outside world? What's going on there?
That is also something that's very common in group psychology, and that is this concept called splitting. Especially when group membership is around aggrieved identities or identities of grievance, in which case they are, like you said, they are the moral ones. They're the victims. Within that lens, they can only be victims and they cannot possibly be destructive. So they see the evil in those who are assigned the status of oppressor. So these demographic or group tags assigned to people, there's no innocent pastime, there's no innocent process. With it comes an assigning of moral innocence or moral culpability. You're morally idealizing or you're morally condemning the individual by virtue of their group association, group identity. And that is the type of splitting that takes place. Now, we all have a natural resistance towards just towards just indiscriminate violence or aggression towards people, but yet people manage to bridge that, to become violent and aggressive towards the other. And what needs to happen is sufficient, what we call devaluation or demonization or scapegoating. So when these groups start fostering their grievance, and with it comes the dehumanization. Think of what happened to that other fellow who's now in an orange overall. What was his surname? Who gunned down some CEO? I can't remember the name.
Oh yes,
Mangione.
Yes,
is that the surname?
Luigi Mangione.
Mangione, that's it. I mean, that type of thing can only happen after sufficient demonization and devaluation of the other, of the oppressor class, and that explains to a large extent why these people act so horribly and so indecently, and why they transformed their workspaces into potential ticking time bombs.
And is that how they can't see what's obvious to those of us that are seeing this clearly, which is that what they are calling inclusion can turn into the most vicious, insulting, offensive, unpleasant behavior, and they still will insist that they're being inclusive because the other person is a mean person. I was thinking of cases like Joe Phoenix's case at the Open University, where there was this catalogue of horrendous behaviour towards her. And, I've met Jo, she's a perfectly nice woman, and it's like, how on earth did they get there? And they're still insisting that they're the good people there. And it's like, once they've decided that you are a certain person and you represent everything that is bad about this group that they have been told is absolutely evil, there is kind of no off switch. They just don't seem to be able to catch themselves. And they don't have that moment of going, wait, have I tipped into being the bad guy here? It doesn't seem to kick in.
Right. You see, because right and wrong is no external standard. Right and wrong is knowledge linked to identity. And if my identity is pure and innocent and good, my knowledge is too, then my judgment according to my knowledge can only be good and pure and true by virtue of my identity.
So there's no way I've possibly got this wrong. No. They never think,
precisely.
Is there any chance I've got this wrong?
No, not
I'm yelling at someone in the corridor.
Because even that doubt gets squashed, because the fellow radicals would say, hey, are you going to join them now? Remember, it's all about power. You're giving away your power.
But what do they actually want? What do they actually want? They want to take over the workplace. What do they want?
I don't think it is as sophisticated as we expect it to be. First of all, this is very sadistic. There's not much rationality and not much strategy behind it. It is utterly destructive. What they want is power. And their idea is that as soon as they gain more power, they see the humiliation of these CEOs and these bosses. It gives them so much sadistic pleasure. And that is what they want to see, and they will keep going. They will keep going. And to know that they swing the scepter, that is sufficient for them. If that company folds, it will also be someone else's fault. I mean, I saw this in South Africa. With this massive affirmative action, politically driven, race-based, and then they were also politically connected appointments. They were corrupt, they were inept, they were just repulsive people, immoral. And then some of these state-owned enterprises, massive enterprises, started folding and falling apart, utterly failed. Guess who they accused? Not themselves, not the African National Congress. They accused the usual suspects: apartheid, colonization, white people. It's a psychological incapacity. It's an impossibility for people with this kind of pathology, especially if this pathology is echoed in the group, to take ownership of what they're doing. Because that would require some form of conscience. And conscience is the first thing that evaporates in the group.
Mm. So you brought us on to how on earth employers should handle these people. And I think thinking about what they want and the fact that they're probably never going to be satisfied with whatever they get, in my view, they seem to be striving for some sort of utopia, but I don't think they're going to know when they get there.
No.
So I think, and they're not going to get there. So for me, there's a sort of collision course happening here. And I think employers are realizing they've indulged these employees for far too long. And I think you're right. I think what you said earlier is really true. There actually aren't that many of the real hardcore. I think those are really the ones that I think employers are going to need to look at them and be willing to lose them, frankly. And maybe that's no great loss. And maybe the other people that are more in the middle are kind of like the whole thing sort of slightly peters out and they don't feel as strongly as they thought they did. And actually, they just want to get on with their work and they actually want to get that promotion, and, they start to, I'm never sure how much, loyalty there is among the group towards each other. I think it's bound by an idea more than it is among each other. So I think we're now reaching a sort of tipping point where I think employers know that they can't keep on indulging these people and they might have to square off against these, against the real hardcore. But I think they're aware this is like quite a unpredictable and emotional group. I guess looking at it from the staff members' point of view, when they start to see their employers pushing back against them, what options do they have and what would be your predictions?
Well, I would say, look, I'm not a business person, but just from my vantage point, short-term loss for long-term gain. They will be short-term loss. So some of these very radical activists may get into trouble and they will get fired or arrested. And they will run to some media house or some newspaper. And their story, their slanted story, riddled with identity politics, will be published in something like The Guardian or New York Times, or whatever the case may be. It will happen. And yes, there might be some tarnishing taking place of the business, but you'll be getting rid of a toxifying agent. Bite the bullet. Short-term loss for long-term gain. Only takes 1, 2, 3 such toxifying agents to really ruin your workplace. Short-term loss for long-term gain. But it's got to be clear. It's got to be written up in policy. It's got to be consistently communicated. Don't linger too long taking action. Don't be inconsistent in your taking action. And be sure among the leaders to not collude with some of these people. Because these people, not only do they split in and out, they also try to split the workplace. So if one leader says, these are the rules, I'm putting down my foot, they will go to the next and try and swing that person's opinion. And if they don't get their way there, they'll go to yet the other person until all their options are exhausted. And then, well, that is what they want. They want to be heard. So what do they tend to do? They start amplifying. So expect amplified behavior in the form of victimhood. You remember about a year ago, you and I had a discussion, and we discussed what could possibly happen in America because things will no longer go these vandals' way. And I called it when I said, expect terrorism. Mm-hmm. And that is precisely what they did. Remember what they did to those Tesla cars. Yep. So some of them will turn criminal, sadly. Okay. But those are the ones you really want to get rid of. Mm. Get rid of this. Focus on merit. There are different reasons why people work or go or apply for positions. 3 motivations, we know that. It's for affiliation. Granted, some of these people want to work in safe and nice workplaces, by all means. Others look for achievement. And those are the ones that you want to hire. Achievement. You want the achievers for the right reasons, who also get along. In other words, they have strong enough affiliative motivations. The problem comes with the people who have power, ego trips, power as their motivation to work at certain places. And if that little madam or little mister has a special tag, an identity tag, and they bought into this DEI ideology, your appointment is a little troublemaker. You will have burdened yourself with some drama for the next several months, maybe even a few years. Don't do that.
Beyond DEI, I'm concerned that the people that are drawn to managerial roles increasingly in the kind of modern world are that third group that are drawn to the power.
They've climbed the echelons.
They're quite often not good at the actual job, so they seem to get their status from being a manager. And people that are actually good at the job don't really want to be a manager because it doesn't really appeal to them. So I think that's I think you get that as well. I guess so their options are, I hope they're not going to burn the place down. You're talking about being criminal, but I mean, they might do, but I think that's probably very extreme. So I think for me, most likely is they'll escalate in some way. They'll try and rally everybody around. They'll try and get some kind of petition going, be quite noisy for, I don't know, a few days a week, maybe. But my prediction would be, having worked before on things like unpaid internships and graduate exit fees, which I don't really want to get into, but those are scenarios where actually if young people had banded together, they could actually have achieved something. They never did it because actually there wasn't really that group loyalty to each other. And it always ended up with one or two people who really wanted to do it. And everybody else said, you know what, I'm not going to pick this fight right now. So I think actually you're likely to get that, but the ones that want to escalate can escalate. So I think that maybe that would be a good thing, and employers, if they're expecting that, would know what to look for. I think it's really interesting what you were saying about the consistency across the decision makers as well.
Yes.
I think one of the reasons they're in this mess is I think they've probably been inconsistent over a number of years. And don't forget, a number of managers and people will have passed through by that point. You may have had a couple of different HR directors in the last 5 years or so. So you've been sending, the organization itself has been sending mixed messages about what behavior is okay and what isn't. Bring your whole self to work, for example. Next thing you know, you've got a protest outside your office in the hallway, you know? So I think maybe employers need to be really clear themselves and drawing a line under that stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean,
Very
one
good.
option, and I guess some of those people that will escalate will either be fired, or some of them will leave and go somewhere else that will indulge
Precisely.
stuff.
Precisely. They will eventually feel unwelcome, because by all means, again, from this generation, there are very decent, very talented, very hopeful individuals among them too, but they are being silenced largely because of the destructive tendencies and this constant threat. It's almost like there's a guillotine hanging over your head all the time, and you better not say the wrong thing, or we'll be coming for you. So there's got to be policies around intimidation too, but it's got to be written in neutral language so that intimidation isn't exclusively linked to identity. Any kind of intimidation, even from the special victims, so-called victims, even intimidation from them ought to be taken care of, so that those who are truly committed to excellence and to driving the business, that they can flourish, and that the environment fosters such flourishing without the envious attacks by these little elements.
I would imagine, lots of these groups seem to say they have ADHD, autism, various issues, behavioral issues. So I think for employers, you're not a lawyer and this is for a different call, but, I would be nervous if I was an employer with them saying, oh, I didn't realize I had to de-escalate because I have ADHD. I'm not very good at judging. So, that kind of situation is difficult for me. So I think employers would be wary of a discrimination claim about being too tough on these people. So this is not really a question for you, but I guess I'm just acknowledging it's not quite as easy as pushing back, doing the tough love thing. It's not quite a super nanny type moment because there's pushback. These people can get lawyers and make an awful lot of fuss, and that costs, even if it doesn't go to court, it ends up with a lot of man hours. So I guess they need to make sure that they're doing this the right way.
Yes.
You'd expect them to claim all sorts of on the way out, how desperate do you think they would get? You think they would start to claim discrimination, things like that, or would they?
Yeah, of course. If they're radicalized enough, they will, by all means. Okay, so by all means, and again, some people with neurodevelopmental diagnosis, again, they are great and they're cooperative, and you can tell whether some of them are truly manipulative or are truly struggling. And it's a pity. It's a pity that many of these measures that have been written into policy, meant for people who are truly struggling, have been hijacked by bad faith actors. It is a pity. But just because someone has a diagnosis shouldn't be an excuse for gross insubordination, for very serious unprofessional behavior. And just keep that in mind. A person can be a victim, yes, but the same person can also be very destructive, very calculated, very manipulative. Both can coexist in the same person. And let this realization guide companies, guide bosses to also write their policies accordingly.
I think also thinking about the senior champions who are sometimes at extremely senior level, if you've got sort of diversity champions on your board, for example, it sounds quite likely that some of these people are going to go to that person and try and get them to pull some strings or to change whatever decision is. And I think for, this is probably CEO level now we're talking about, they need to make sure that anybody who's in that group I'm thinking, for example, somebody who's got a trans-identified child who might be at that senior level, if somebody difficult from the LGBT staff group comes to them and says, I can't believe it, I've been given a formal warning, blah, 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 that's possibly a moment when the conversation needs to come up with the person with the trans-identified child to say this isn't actually appropriate for you to be involved in this decision. So I think it actually might end up opening up conversations which frankly should have been had some time ago. I've discussed this on a previous episode actually with Paul Sweeney called Are Activist CEOs Out of Control? And we talked about this issue of when a senior champion or a senior stakeholder is too close to a subject and whether they should remove themselves from that decision, if someone should remove them and make that decision themselves. So I think this might need to go quite senior. I think it would be good if the senior people are all on board. So if you're an HR director, you want to make sure you've got the support of your CEO before you go in with this stuff and anticipate some of the moves that these activist staff might make. That sounds like you think that would be sensible, right?
Yeah, that's an immediate potential conflict of interest.
I guess there's a third option, isn't there, which is that these people could just sort of transcend and just grow up and kind of integrate and just take the memo and just think, you know what, maybe it's time. You don't think it's as likely. I mean, do you know, I've actually seen some positive signs on this, but you don't think this is good. I'll tell you mine in a minute. Go on, you tell me your thoughts.
Well, by all means, look, I think many can transcend this. Many can transform the workspace again. Can adopt a more sensible way of doing business and of relating in organizations. But remember now, some have decided that this will be the hill they die on. Some have made this their life's mission. It's very, very difficult now to turn around and say, oh, you know what? They might come across as cowardly. So there will be those who will be hardcore, who will stick to their identity, their life's mission, who will be very opposed to adopting any other perspective or nuance than the one that they have been following for say a decade. Others will. Others will be more than ready to do that because of this chaos that has been unleashed in the workplace. I just think, when you're someone like a DI champion, gosh, that just screams radicalized to me. Okay. I think the majority of them would be extremely radical. And that can be problematic. I think that can be extremely problematic. And I want to compare it to a family. A family with their 4 children might have a standard of how to regulate behavior, discipline, how to discipline their family. And then there might be an aunt or a grandmother, and by virtue of their positioning very close to certain of the children, they can really wreak havoc. So some of these DEI champions could be a potential troublemaker, only amplifying the courage among these radicals. Difficult. I don't know how employers will deal with those so-called champions, especially if they decided that was the hill they were going to die on. I don't know. But you know what? Maybe just allow time to see how this develops. I don't know.
Yeah, I've seen some. The encouraging signs I've seen have been around on the kind of trans and LGBT stuff. I've seen some signs that some of they would say trans men, so women with a trans identity, are kind of seem to be integrating rather than escalating. There's two quite well-known trainers who've announced recently on LinkedIn that they're actually going to pursue other careers now that the kind of lived experience market has kind of collapsed. But it's actually the healthiest thing I've seen them post in an awfully long time. And I like the fact that they're going on to do other stuff. I think the trans identified men, they would say trans women, I think are more likely to escalate. I think we've seen some of that already from, these are not employees, but there's that group in the UK, Bash Back, which seems to be, I don't know if they even are trans women or who they are, but that's the sort of group that I think are more likely to escalate. And I haven't seen any signs of them climbing down. So I think we might actually end up with, ironically enough, quite a binary split among who decides to integrate and whether biological females are much more likely to do that integrating thing, because it's just you read the room and think, this isn't going my way. I'm going to blend in here.
Right. And let's think again. Biologically, there tends to be higher agreeableness among women than men. And it tends to be greater aggression among men than among women. So if I had to guess, the kind of escalation will mostly aggressive escalation, like Bash Back and what they did to the Free Speech Union, hacking the Free Speech Union's internal server. I wasn't surprised when I saw that it was a biological man who did that. But you see, that's the type of criminal sabotage, vandalism behavior that we can expect.
I think they've also smashed in the windows of the EHRC office. So that, but I mean, look, this. I mean, that's probably high level that you're not going to see within a workplace. You'd be unlikely to see that. But I think that
doxing in a workplace.
Yeah.
And character assassination, leaking nasty information to media houses or to competitors.
Do you think the trans issue is most likely to be the thing that kicks it all off? I mean, particularly the single-sex spaces is going to be the flashpoint more than race or anything else.
That is my sense, and there are many very troubled individuals who are trans-identified who really just want to go about their day and their lives. They really don't want to be involved in all these political disputes, and at the end of the day, they are the ones that are going to suffer unnecessarily. But I do think it is these very destructive radicals who really want to change and destroy, dismantle society and our culture. They will be the major troublemakers. And I think my sense is that it will be around the trans issue more so than it will be around any of the other issues such as race or neurodiversity.
I was just thinking about Palestine possibly being another issue that would be that they would die on that hill. But you think the trans thing is more?
Well,
I'm not sure they quite know I don't think they really know what they're fighting for with the Palestine one. Whereas I think the trans really
precisely
is deeper and more.
My sense is that the Palestine issue was very acute a couple of years ago until recently. I think there's this exhaustion around the Palestine issue now, but the trans issue has not let off. It's still been a rather potent issue, even in the minds of those who are not as focused on these political issues. Yeah.
Okay, well,
That's
we'll
my
see.
sense.
Yeah. Okay. Was there anything else?
Is that a prediction? We'll see.
Yeah. Was there anything else you wanted to add that I didn't cover?
No, I think this is great. I think this is great. I do think there is a major cultural shift taking place. There's been latent feelings, latent sentiments that are rising to the surface. There's a major groundswell coming to clarify certain things about identity, about reality, about what needs to be done, common sense stuff. There's a groundswell of latent stuff that's really going to rise to the surface with massive momentum. Of course, there's going to be pushback. There is possibly going to be a lot of clashes too, violent clashes too. But I think this is currently unstoppable. And I think businesses need to do the responsible thing. Families need to do the responsible thing. Let me just be a bit of a psychologist too. Look after your own, look after yourself, look after your networks, your friendships. Mind one another. Because I think we're in for a rough ride, but I think it is much needed. It's much needed. It's going to be corrective in many, many ways.
I've started a new community for employers, which is called This Is Working. And we're meeting up on the 10th of February, actually. The topic for the next event is HR holding back British business? And so we'll come together to talk about that. These sorts of issues, I think, are going to keep coming up. And what I really want to do is create a community of employers so they can talk to each other. And as the sorts of issues you and I have talked about today will kind of continue to come up, I think, throughout the year and beyond, I think they might be very grateful that they've got that community, because actually they need to know that everyone's having these problems. I reckon that Condé Nast guy might just have thought it was a Condé Nast problem almost. And it's like, if he's listening to this, solidarity for him, because actually it turns out everyone's having the same problem. And if you know everyone's having the same problem, you can sort of say, okay, what are we doing here?
Of course.
And it's
business chambers.
It's almost like the parents all getting together to go, how are you doing? You've taken the kind of super nanny role today and sort of saying, look, guys, be strong, be tough. It's actually not only is it what the business needs, it's actually what young people need as well. I think we've got into this mess because there've not been enough boundaries.
Right. Build consensus. Those guys, the various different businesses in business chambers, build consensus. Find ways of translating it into policy, of operationalizing it, and see how your workplaces transform. Do it.
Well, and let's hope that the sensible ones who you want to keep will be able to read the room and think, I'm going to integrate here. And the ones that want to pursue this to the very end, they can do that elsewhere, and you're happy to let them go. Well, that's our advice. I don't know. I hope that's been helpful to people listening. I mean, we probably should do a proper legal clinic, but I actually think a sort of psychology clinic was what people needed first. And I think there has been some very strange stuff going on. And so if you're out there thinking, this is getting a bit crazy, like some of these kids are not okay. And they're not even just kids. Some of them are older. It's not just you. There is something very strange in the water at the moment. So anyway, we will keep talking about all these issues. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Talk to you soon. Thank you.